Hey, Dana.
Hey, Todd. Great to be back.
Good seeing you.
Great to see you as well.
So I was kind of hearing in the background, hearing you guys chat a little bit. Sounds like things are going well. I'm excited to hear that.
Yeah, they are going really well. As you know, can't complain about growth, and real estate's an interesting time to be in the market right now. Things, how they were 2 years ago, are definitely different than they are now with inflation and everything else. So,
Yeah, it's definitely things are crazy. Been serving this housing market for over 30 years now. And, you know, every crazy market has its own uniqueness. And I haven't seen anything like what we've experienced in the last year and a half. And but I am starting to see, I don't know about the West Coast, but I am starting to see some shifting in the market. And we thank you for being back. So the last time that we spoke, man, you had a big trip.
yes, I did. I'm back from the big trip across the world, I should say.
You made it.
Yes, I did, with two twins on a flight for 28 hours there and 28 hours back. We survived. I'm not sure if the people around us did, but we did survive.
I think I've been on some of those flights where you're just like, oh.
Yeah,
The last flight we were on, we had a barking dog for a little bit. So
oh wow.
it was kind of
it's
interesting. It
it's
wasn't
sort
a
of
screaming child. It was a barking dog. Well, somebody's child, right?
yeah, planes are kind of like rental properties too, because you have like the barking dog next door, or the child who's too much pitter patter, and you have a
Very
condo
true.
complex, right?
And not
It's
so
dealing with the same
temporary.
things. Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
not so temporary. Well, tonight we're going to talk about one of the topics. I guess it's a little controversial. I mean, we're going to keep it. We're going to try and keep everybody cool, not get ourselves in trouble tonight. But we are going to talk about the rental market. And I mean, it's the rental market is as hot as the sale market, and I think a lot is going on. I think a lot of the buyers have decided to rent, and that's kind of tightened it up a little bit because of the high purchase pricing. And but we've also had a very long eviction moratorium, and I think a lot of people want to talk about that. And so maybe we can shed some light on that tonight. And really, I mean, I don't know what you're seeing on the West Coast, but we're seeing where the prices are just going up and up on the rental market. And, sometimes, I mean, we get 100 calls of people that are inquiring about the rental, and whether it's a single family house, excuse me, or an apartment. And I know a lot of apartment complexes now have wait lists.
Mhm.
And so we're going to talk about it tonight. I'm Todd Sachs. I'm the broker and founder of Sachs Realty here in Maryland. We are a boutique brokerage here, and we help buyers and sellers, tenants and landlords of both residential and commercial real estate. But if you're anywhere in the country and you need real estate assistance, I have an amazing broker network. Be happy to connect you to somebody in your town if you don't have an agent. So all of my contact information is and will be below, as well as our returning contributor, Dana Dunford. She is so kind to be with us tonight. Not quite as late in the evening here on the East Coast. She's from the West Coast. She's from California. So again, Dana, thank you so much for being on our show. Just kind of tell everybody a little bit about you and introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for having me, Todd. So my name's Dana Dunford. I live here in San Francisco. So opposite coast. But I think that from that perspective, it's good to have both perspective of what's going on with the coasts and what's going on with eviction moratoriums and everything else in place, since no city is operating the same. As far as what I do, I help real estate investors get set up for success with property management. So I really focus on setting up the best processes for property managers or for owners of properties. 72% of rental properties are self-managed. So if you're managing your rental properties yourself, you're not alone. And so we're here to make sure there's less hassle for you. And also we track, to Todd's point, the industry trends, what's going on in the rental market. prices, everything that we see at a macro level, to help you at a micro level determine, is this a good investment? Should I go sell it with Todd and pick up another one, or whatever it may be?
Yeah, and I have to tell you, I mean, there's a lot of a lot of concern on some of the landlords. So I do have clients actually here locally that and we've spoken before, and we have a video, Dana, that has helped so many people, you and I, as we spoke about landlording and things like that, and tonight we're going to kind of pick up with that as well. But I have to tell you, I have a lot of landlords that, and as we spoke before, a lot of them make up of the owners of 2, 3, maybe 5 properties. We're not talking about the bulk of landlords. We're not talking about landlords that own hundreds of properties, right? I mean, they exist, thousands of doors, right? But we're talking about the bulk of small business owners that have tried to go into this space. And then, because of the moratorium, or, what has happened over the last year and a half, I've gotten a lot of calls where people are saying, hey, look, soon as, we can get evictions going, we want to sell our properties. We don't want to be in this business anymore. And I know, and this is a touchy subject for a lot of people. And again, we're not trying to offend anybody, but we're just trying to talk about the facts tonight and just kind of bring everyone up to date with what's going on. So Dana, I mean, what, any data, any current data? I know you guys, you're a tech enabled platform, which is fantastic. And guys, we've all of Dana's information published already in the show notes on wherever you're watching this podcast. Dana has, she's collecting a lot of these tech companies. I mean, they collect a lot of AI. They have a lot of good data because they have to, right? I mean, they're getting, they're compiling this data so that they can be better in helping not just landlords or property managers or real estate agents, but tenants too. And this platform that they have, which feel free to explore, is fantastic for that, because it kind of brings everybody together and in a very creative way. But certainly, that's, we're not being paid by Dana right now to say these things. She's just a good, resource for you and for us, Dana. So kind of bring us up to date on what's going on with the moratorium.
Yeah, so I think there's two things. I'll start at kind of macro level of what we've seen happen, and how next time we have a crisis like this, a pandemic, hopefully some parties have learned their lessons. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll talk about we are nationwide. We're in all 50 states. So some of the data that we see as well. So just to start with the eviction moratorium, I think everyone can agree that they're not against saying, hey, people need to be in their homes, and that they need to, and we need to stop spreading coronavirus. That I think everyone agrees with, no matter if you're, no matter what political party you're in. People do agree that health is important. Now, what it really comes down to is execution. And that's everything. Everything's about execution. I mean, we have the federal funding assistance, right? We have over close to 47 billion of funding of federal assistance for rentals. And only 11% of that has been deployed. And that is where landlords are really struggling, because they say, hey, our tenants are behind. Someone should pay us because we're a small business. To your point, it's not like it's these big corporations that have balance sheets with a ton of assets and cash in the bank. It's people who are living based off those rental payments to make their mortgage. So that's one thing that we're hearing, and I'm sure you're hearing that, Todd, as well. Of, hey, everyone wants everyone to be happy in this situation, and better execution next time will hopefully help that. And states are finally realizing, hey, they need to deploy this capital. If they don't deploy the capital, they lose it, right? And so, in California, we have that where it's like 2.6 billion has been allocated to California, but 22% of that has been dispersed. And there's certain guidelines that if they don't disperse, I think it's 56% or something by the end of September, they lose getting more allocation. And so suddenly we're starting to see that execution, but I think it's a bit too late. That will definitely help landlords if we can get that out there. So that's kind of at the macro level. There's a lot of stats going around. There's some that say 20% of renters are going to be evicted. None of those numbers add up or make sense to me. The kind of middle number I've seen is 10%. However, I still, based on our own internal data, and I don't trust anyone else's data. I always trust our own data. I still think 10% might be a little bit high. However, we are a tech-enabled platform, so I would say tenants who don't use technology are not really factored into our numbers, and so that 10% could potentially be accurate. But we're seeing it on our end closer to 3 to 4% of tenants that would, if you look at the market, where rental rates are and where ours are, if you take that subset and say, okay, for rentals between $500 to $1,000, here's the percentage that would be evicted. If we go through that, we see it at more at like 3 to 4%. That's based on our own data of who is using our platform. However, I think that's what we're here to talk about today, Todd. A lot of it is like qualifications of tenants and fair housing and making sure you're very objective, because I think this has been a wake-up call to landlords that they need education. They need to understand what qualifies for the eviction moratorium. They need to understand how to qualify tenants, how to mitigate risk, all of that. And I think that's really what comes to light throughout the eviction moratorium. So anyways, hopefully that's not too long-winded of an answer for you on what we're seeing.
So what I hear you saying is, based on the numbers that we're hearing in the mainstream media, they're talking about a much higher percentage than what it really actually is.
Exactly. That's correct. Like you'll hear stats where they'll say things like, I think it was like something like 10 million renters are behind on their payments. But they're talking about renters. They're not talking about renter households. So really, it's more like less than 5 million renter households, like actual individual homes that renters are in, because average has just over two per rental property. I think about renter households, not renters, but they give the stats as how can we blow this number up as much as possible. And so that would be just my one caveat with it, is make sure you're aligning apples to apples when you're doing the analysis and looking at that. And then, the data is all over the place because everything comes from a different source. And that's what, Todd, you and I know, like the rental properties is a very fragmented market. The average landlord owns between 2 to 4 rental properties. They don't own a lot. So trying to consolidate all of that data and have one party come up with a really good estimate of what is the impact and implication is very difficult. And a lot of times when tenants fill out the surveys too, it could be that there's a bias of, I say I can't pay, but maybe they could, just because maybe they're worried about not having a couple of months of savings when they're back on their feet, they're getting their jobs back, et cetera. So I think the most important thing here to take away is, like, one, execution could be a lot better from the government next time, and really deploying the capital so landlords and contractual law is not suffering. And then two, data is very difficult to get, and like the best would probably be from the Census Bureau, but good luck of them trying to get that into people's hands and get the data in enough time, because usually the surveys they're doing are from like 2 to 3 years ago.
Right. Or we'll get the information in 10 years. I'm just kind of curious, why do you think, I mean, we were so good at getting cash in the hands of other business owners.
Yeah.
I mean, with the PPP and things like that, and no matter what size your business was, really, right? And then, I mean, we were also very good at getting stimulus checks and things like. Why don't you think that this money? How much did you say it was?
The money that we have is 46.5 billion in federal rental
And
assistance
this has
total.
been there for a while, right?
Yeah, this has been there for a while, and they dispersed basically started in 11% was dispersed in that was from May, June, and July was 11% that had been dispersed by then. So not a lot. And then that was just to get to the states. Then you have to think about from the states to get it to the actual counties and get it allocated out. And I actually have a good response for that, Todd. Because actually, if you look at the PPP, it was very similar. The businesses that were incorporated like a C corporation and had really good tax records and could get things done and get documentation out very quickly, they could get PP funding in a day or two. Like it was super easy, and they could go through their banks because all the banks were enabling for them to get the PPP loan. All those corporations are have a bank, have like a business bank. They're dealing with banks and like corporations that are pretty fast because they're working with businesses, and so they're fast at execution and implementing, more so than like a credit union or something like that, where it's not as large as some of these other banks. And then so they could get the loans really quickly. What's really interesting is if you talk to the small business owners. So, for example, the artists of the world and the hairdressers of the world, like these are friends of mine that I talk to and ask, hey, did you get your PPP funding? Like, you're the ones at the biggest risk here. And all of them said no. It took us so long. And they were asking for so much more documentation and verification. And I think that that has to do with um, the smaller you become, right? The smaller you are from that perspective, the more difficult it is for the federal government to verify it. And so with rental housing assistance, it gets even more difficult because the government's like, we can't have an API with like the IRS to confirm, does this tenant still work for ABC restaurant, right? They just can't verify that. And so what ends up happening is they need documentation and a letter, and then they say, oh, to the county, you're responsible for verifying this. And then it was a huge administrative process, so it wasn't automated. And then it took so long. But for C corporations, LLCs that were really set up, that had a really good track record, super easy for them to just go based off their IRS records, put in there some documentation of here's our employees then, here's our employees now, and for them to get funding within 2 to 3 business days. But for renters, it's much more difficult. If I say I don't work for ABC restaurant, a lot of times it's like, oh gosh, now how do we go back and verify that with them? They're not all working in these API systems and with the banks. And then some of these tenants are either unbanked or they work with much smaller banks where they don't know, oh, I go to Wells Fargo and I can get this overnight. They just don't know that. And so what ended up happening, I think, was the only way to verify, because they didn't want every tenant coming to them say, give me some free rent here. The only way for them to verify it was to essentially make the process very slow with manual verification. And anytime you get humans involved to manually verify things, with that many renters, 10 million renters, you're going to have a problem. And so I think that is the biggest reason that it's taken so long to have the capital dispersed. And I think potentially a better way to do it would have been to give the money directly to the landlords and somehow have it where the tenant verified through the landlord, here's my lease contract. Somehow they have some documentation of here's what the tenant said, as far as they couldn't pay. And the landlord saying, go to Wells Fargo, get the, you know what I mean? And got that set up because they're a business. And so they're aligned in that incentive of we should get this done as quickly as possible. So just kind of food for thought, but I think it's the size of the business that matters. And renters are obviously one individual person. So the longest to get federal funding and assistance.
Yeah, I'm just and we'll talk a little bit about the effects of this, not just from a landlord, but from a tenant as well, and getting other housing once the evictions start to happen. I mean, that's another situation that we're going to have. Well, I know, like I said, locally here, I have a lot of clients and people that are inquiring, saying that, hey, when they can evict, they are out of the business. They're not going to own rentals anymore. In fact, I go see one next week about, they did have the tenant has left now, and we're going to take a look and see at what type of work is necessary to put it on the market to sell it to the retail side, because there is such a shortage in housing on the retail side right now. But that also brings up a really important question. How will that affect the already tightened rental market? Because if a lot of these houses go to the retail side that would, have been a single family rental, what kind of effect is that going to have, long term? Do you know any landlords specifically that are struggling with this?
Yeah, I do know a few, but it's very few as a total percentage of landlords I know. And I think a part of it may be a bias. Like most landlords who come to Hemlane want to be educated, want to set up a process for success, and are like willing to pay a little bit for like no headache and that peace of mind. And I think you're a lot of the small mom and pops who like don't do any research, really get emotion into it, do everything through pen and paper, or like still drive down and collect the rent checks are usually the ones who potentially shouldn't be in the landlord business. I actually don't think that the supply of rental homes will, if you think of like 6 to 12 months, will dry up. And here's why. You have seen rental rates increase over time. And I can't remember the exact numbers I just saw, but they were like going back up like this. And one thing I would say about it is that you're seeing institutional investors. So we were talking about the retail investor, like the small mom and pop saying, I'm over it, I'm out of it. You're seeing institutionals, so these hedge funds of the world, go and buy up 500 properties and go just make them rentals. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it's inflation or stagflation, whatever you want to think about today, where they say, hey, I need to park things into physical assets right now, right? My dollar tomorrow is not worth a dollar again. They say the inflation rate's under 10%, but there's some that argue it's actually above that. And so these institutional investors come in and buy up in situations like this, and they'll convert something that was going to be owner occupied, because they're now attracted to the single family home market. They'll buy something that was originally supposed to be owner occupied and go and rent it because they see that. And so the market sort of plays out that way. And so I don't foresee there to be a shortage. Where I think there will be a shortage is in micro areas. So there have been trends, and I won't deny a lot of people are leaving San Francisco where I am, right? Going to dinner tonight with a friend because he's leaving for Austin. He's on a one-way flight. And that's one of those things where those people are not coming back here. So now we have more inventory here, or at least reduced prices. And then you'll see in these hotter markets like Austin, Nashville, Atlanta, you can name multiple cities in Florida as well. You're actually seeing that, you do see that where there is a shortage of rental properties, but I think there's a shortage of every property. It's just based on these trends of where people are moving to. And so from that perspective, I think there is going to be some microeconomics playing out, and you'll see that as an investor based on where you are, things will be a lot different, and the equation will be a lot different than like here in San Francisco. If you want a rental, go to Soma, you'll be one application out of, for 3 months, probably the only one, and at a much better rate than you could get before. And so I do think those trends play a lot into this. And at the macro level, I still think the hedge funds are coming in and putting a lot into rentals. And then once they see things change, they'll sell them all off, and they'll go back to the small mom and pops after the small mom and pops of the world say, okay, we're going to try this again. We have this dream of becoming a landlord and passive income and all of that. Yeah.
So, and mentioning the hedge funds, I mean, it's so true. I mean, one of the reasons why we have so much housing shortage in the first place, I think they said like 30% of all the houses being sold are being purchased by these institutional buyers. I mean, they have hundreds of millions in cash, right? What do you think the strategies? I mean, you think it's more of a, they buy them and rent them and hold them for 5 years? I mean, what are you hearing a lot of the strategies are for these hedge funds?
Most of them are buy and hold, and they do it based on the cyclical nature of where is it best to put my money. And so some cases they say, let's just sell off these 500 homes. It's better to put our money into something else, and they'll make that determination. Now, institutionals are not the largest. They're the fastest growing right now for like folks purchasing properties, but they still, out of the 16 million renter households in the US, they only own it. Well, this was last year, it was 300,000 of the homes. And I don't see that needle moving too much in like the grand scheme of things. And so from that perspective, they do go in waves, you'll see. And as a small mom and pop, they'll come back in a couple of years. Some small mom and pops are still attracted to buying rentals right now. And it's usually the newer investors who say, okay, we've got mortgage rates at an all-time low. Let's go in and get a really good 30-year fixed. Okay, I see inflation going up. I need to park my money into a physical asset because that money is the next day. Like we just saw, I think it was yesterday, did the Dow fall farther than it ever had since May? So they're like, okay, let me get the money out of stock market and put it into an actual asset. So I think you're going to see a lot of and then they say the eviction moratorium is over. They have that same mindset of, okay, there's all these investors who are now out of the market
Right, they're
because
going to
they
dump their
hated it.
property.
They're going to dump their property. And now I don't have an eviction moratorium. And so I think you are going to see a lot of new investors go into the market as well. So I think it will be a combination from that perspective of both. As you will see some selling, but you also see new ones coming into the market. And hopefully the new ones learn their lesson of education. This is not a joke business. Like we just had an eviction moratorium where you physically for nearly 2 years couldn't get your tenant out of the property. That's serious, right? Like you really need to understand tenant landlord law, qualify your tenants, etc.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. I mean, that's, with the investors that are hanging on and the ones that are new entering the space. We've learned a lot. And Dana, I know, one of the things that you said was, education. And, I can't tell you, I mean, looking at even their leases, they go to the office supply store and they, buy a pack of leases or they'll download something online. And, I mean, it has some of the important things, at least nationally that, sort of you see in leases, lead paint, things like that. But they don't really do background checks. They're not screening properly. So let's just, let's just kind of say of the lessons that we've learned over the last almost 2 years, where were some of the biggest mistakes that landlords made that sort of, I mean, you couldn't look, some people, there were winners and losers through this pandemic. And I get it. I mean, there were a lot of people lost their jobs. I understand. I am very empathetic to that. And there are, as a small business owner, most of us do care. And, we're from a small business enterprise, if you will. I mean, a lot of times the business owners are sticking their checks in the drawer, right? I mean, they're paying their people first, their employees, trying to, small businesses, big corporations, they'll lay off quicker, things like that. I mean, us small business owners tend to hold on to things and try and keep the people and care about their families and work with them. I mean, I can't tell you, I work with tenants, they couldn't pay me. It's fine. No problem. It was the communication. It was their effort. It was them trying. It was them caring that really establishes those relationships that are going on both sides of the fence where we're working hard to help everybody get through it. And then obviously, like in any situation, there are some landlords and tenants that just aren't that way, right? I mean, they take advantage of things if they can and things like that. And that's life. We get people, that just happens. But the fact of the matter is, in this situation with winners and losers, and then we had a situation where no matter what, you couldn't you couldn't evict anybody, or well, I won't say no matter what, because there were situations where you can tenant holding over, which means that the lease is expired and you sent them, a termination of the lease, and then they stayed, which you could still get the tenant out, but it was a process. And then I guess like an unlawful detainer where there's just no lease at all in place, squatters, right? I mean, it's so, and every state's different, and we're not going to
Yeah.
I don't want to get into the legal, things and things like that, but it is what it is. Where the situation is what the situation is. So I guess, what are some of the mistakes that you've seen landlords make that they probably could have avoided, some of the things that's happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's an operational process. So let's just say you made the mistake of you didn't screen the tenant beforehand. Let's just worst case scenario, you didn't screen your tenants. You're in this situation now and you're listening to us. And you didn't screen the tenant. They've been very difficult throughout the process. And you're trying to figure out the best case scenario. And I think it comes down to exactly what you said, Todd: communication. It's communication and professionalism. There are some people who should not be in this business because they take everything emotionally, and they can't put themselves in the tenant's shoes at all. And to your point, like, you did put yourself in the tenant's shoes. Hey, they're trying to get rental assistance. They told me they were going down to the city to apply for a program and get money, and like, I'm working with them towards that, and I will make sure that I can do whatever it takes to support them through that process. That's communication coupled with project management. That's what you need to be successful in it. But those who suddenly can't put themselves in the shoes of the tenants or can't do that project management, that's where things get dicey. So for example, there are some landlords I've seen where they say, yeah, the tenant hasn't paid me for a year, right? And they're still living there. And it's like, okay, well, what programs has the tenant applied for? That's out there. We know that the federal funding is out there. What programs have they applied for? Well, they said they were applying to a program. Okay, which one did they tell you they were applying to? When did they say they were going to do it? Did you ask them for a date? Okay, they told you that date. Did you follow up the following day and ask them how it went and how you could support them, or potentially write a letter as the landlord? You could provide the lease agreement to the rental assistance program, letting them know you're the landlord and you can confirm that you haven't gotten rent. Like, how are you helping the tenant through it? And so this is a people business. You still need to make sure that you have those lines of communication. And so the landlords where I've seen that not happen is like, let's just say you did all those things at the beginning where you didn't screen the tenants, you haven't gone through a process, or you did screen the tenants and the tenant lost their job and it truly was COVID related and unforeseen. In either case, it's that communication. But there's so many landlords I know who won't pick up the phone and call their tenants and have it like that adult conversation of, okay, you're applying for this. At what point? Did you know there's this other program in the city? You want to go apply to that one? I'm here to support you through that process. I think communication is the biggest. And then also knowing the law. There's some landlords I talked to who are like, yeah, my tenants haven't paid for 3 months. And but I can't evict them due to COVID. And it's like, well, did you get a letter from them stating that they've been affected by COVID? No, they just told me that they can't pay. It's like, whoa. You need to know your county laws. You need to know your state laws. You need to know what the proper forms are. And the second you set yourself up for that success, your tenants are going to work with you because they know you're professional. And so in some of these cases, I even sort of take the side of the tenant of being like, well, the landlord didn't really do their homework here, right? This is a two-way agreement, and on both sides, the one who's more educated wins. And so, and it shouldn't be like a win-win, but you know what I mean? Like gets a good outcome in it. And so if you can have both sides educated, it will make it a lot better of an outcome, because you'll get the federal funding, you'll get communication between the two of you, you'll understand timelines and what's going to happen, and you won't go to sleep thinking, will they pay next month? So I think that's like at a kind of a high level, without going into too many details, what I see.
Yeah, and locally here, a lot of times if you don't have the proper rental license, I mean, even in we're in an environment where it's not COVID and you're trying to evict a tenant because of failure to pay, um, you better have a rental license and it better be valid. And a lot of times, people are putting tenants in places and they're not properly licensed. And sometimes they have multi-unit dwellings that aren't even legally multi-unit. They're not, I'm sure you guys have the same thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I've seen where, people, I mean, if any lesson to learn here, make sure that not, besides the fact that you have, a good solid lease in place, and consult with professionals if you're going to be in this business. Like Dana said, this is not one of those businesses that if you make a mistake that you may recover from. I mean, it's costly. And a
Yeah.
lot of times, landlords are making like 300, 400 bucks over their expenses a month. So let's just say it's even $500, and so $6,000 a year that you're clearing after you pay your mortgage, your taxes, any utilities that you may be covering, insurance. So what happens, $6,000 if you're having that tenant, even if they just renew, or move out in a year, you have to go back in and re-prep that place for, to rent. I mean, a security deposit, if they have destroyed the place, is not going to be enough. So this is not the kind of business that you want to just go haphazardly with, because it is real. I mean, the effects, you can damage your credit, lose the house, lots of different things, end up in court if you're not doing it right. Dana, obviously, I mean, a big thing, and that everybody has to be mindful for is, making sure that, and one of the things that's happening is that we're getting in a rental. We just rented a single family house. We probably had 50 or 60 people that were interested in renting it. It rented in a couple days. The actual landlord raised the rent price, and because it was so competitive. And lots of times you don't have an agent. You're doing this on your own, renting it on your own. And
Mhm.
how do you qualify? Because you do have, it doesn't matter whether you're represented by an agent or not. I mean, there are laws, or federal laws or state laws. You have to know what your state is as far as how you determine the application process. You have to be mindful not to discriminate. And, so Dana, what advice can you give somebody that, they're looking to get into this, or, they've been through the last 2 years, maybe not with the best, outcome. And now they're recovering, their market's tight. What kind of advice can you tell people to make sure that they're staying compliant, and, and to help them with the process? There's really 2 steps, right? I mean, there's there's more. Let's just break it down to 3 steps. You have advertising of that, right? Then you have the actual, process of, interviewing to get them to an application. And then, because you may just ask some qualifying questions before you actually take their money and run an application, a check. And then really you have, let's just say you have 10 people that you're trying to, they all meet your criteria,
Yep.
how in the world, making sure that you're being mindful to the things that you should be, you're giving everybody a fair shake. What advice do you have?
Yeah, I think this actually goes down to the point you just made with like ADUs and people who don't get their license to operate their rental property. Certain cities require that. It's that you get too greedy with things, and you always think the grass is greener on the other side. Oh, I'll just put a unit downstairs and look how much more money I can make. And it's the same thing with qualifying applicants and selecting an applicant. There's some states like fair housing in California, where I am, where it's first come, first serve. It's not built into the civil code. Like the civil code does not write that anywhere, but fair housing says that. And so they can basically take that to court. And so the biggest thing is making sure, like, no matter what, I don't care who the people are, is that you are super objective. And the biggest things you hear of people where they deny tenants is things like kids or roommates, where they're like, oh, they have kids, they're going to be worse tenants, so we're going to deny them and move on to this couple that doesn't have kids. Or roommates. There's 3 of them moving into the place and they're roommates. I don't want them. I want to make sure it's a couple. I don't want to rent to them. And really, this is your world, not the actual world of fair housing. And you always have to think of the benefits of accepting these people. People with kids tend to like move less. You should just keep them equally qualified, right? They don't want to move their kids out of school district. People who have multiple tenants, roommates, they're going to have multiple incomes. One loses their job, you've got 2 others to pay for it, and they're jointly responsible. That's fantastic. That's even better than a couple where maybe only one person works. And so try to stop taking those biases out and have a super clear process. So it starts with advertising. When you advertise your property, and we do this in our system as well, we say, what is the minimum credit? What is the minimum income to rent ratio? And what I mean by that is it's like 2.5 to 3. 3 is pretty standard. So if the rental is going for $2,000 a month, whoever is applying, they jointly need to make at least $6,000 a month. If they don't make $6,000 a month, they're going to be at risk. And if we have time, I'll get into assets and how that plays out for trust fund kids. But anyways, so you basically have these criteria and you put those on the actual rental rental marketing. So when you list your property on Zillow and Dunford and Truly on Hot Pads and Apartment List, you put it on there. Why do you do that? One, tenants will actually see that and say, this is someone who's professional. If I don't have the credit score, I know this person's going to pull credit. So I might as well just move somewhere else if I don't meet their criteria. And you can put other things like no evictions, et cetera, on there. Although certain states like California now, you cannot say no, you can't use evictions that were during COVID against the tenants, just so you know, based on fair housing. So check your state's laws. But once you go through that process, then it's the showings time to show your property. If you're going to have 12 months with this person, a relationship, make sure you give them a call beforehand, or we have just like an online form. Make sure they actually go through and read that and say, yes, I meet the credit criteria. Yes, I meet the income criteria. Yes, I don't have any evictions. You want to make sure that they know that you're running a standard process. Then where I see the biggest thing with fair housing and threats is where owners go in and they say, my application is $45. All of you give me $45. And they say, wow, I got 50 applicants. They're getting greedy, right? I'm taking money from all of them. I don't even care if you're following fair housing. If you reject 49 of those tenants, I can with the high rate of conviction here, will think that one of them will go and say, oh, there's some fair housing here, or something going wrong. The landlord discriminated against me, and they'll make your life miserable. And so the best thing to do is to have a free application. Everyone do the application, and only those who are serious, who have on the application confirmed their income meets my criteria. I see their pay stubs, their bank statements. I can see that they are ready to move in. They have the security deposit and first month's rent in that bank account. Once you go through that process, then you run the background and credit check. Don't run it on all of them. And then typically you have 1, maybe 2 that have gone through that process and fast enough. And you tell them, hey, just as a heads up, this one application came in first. I'll request the background and credit check from you, but if these people qualify, I have to move forward with them. I just have to let you know they came in first. That way, when you get to the second group, there's no surprises. No one comes back to you and says there was a fair housing violation. But typically, it's interesting. When I see fair housing violations, it's usually when money's involved. It's usually when someone has paid an application fee or a background and credit check and gotten far enough through the process, and suddenly the landlord has said, nope, you're denied. And I actually think it's a disservice to tenants. I have to kind of side with the tenants here. If you're a tenant and you're applying to 3 places and each one of them has a background and credit check of $50, I mean, ours is a lot cheaper than that. But if each one, it's pretty standard to have $50, you're paying $150 and you're like, it's an emotional time. You're moving, you're trying to find a place. You don't want to get rejected. It's kind of like going on a date and someone is telling you they don't want to go on a second date with you. It's very similar. And so just make sure you follow a really good process. And that's why personally I'm really opposed to application fees. I think that's usually where I see the most fair housing violations. And then the other one is obviously in tenancy, as well as with service animals and things like that. We see that come up a lot. And like reasonable accommodations, of not making reasonable accommodations for someone who needs it. But those are kind of minor. Usually when I see threats and tenants getting very upset, it's because they paid money and they got declined anyways. And they're like, why would you take me through that process if you were going to decline me? I had the credit, I had the income, I think I qualified, and you basically didn't accept my application.
Yeah, I used to be with a brokerage that actually allowed the tenants to collect the fees, or the agents collect the fees for the rental applications. And I think everybody now has gone online, just to kind of get away from, I don't want to collect the money. I'm not taking the cash. I'm not, just, send them, we send a link out to the platform that we use. We don't require it, but, a lot of the agents use the same service. And, and they just deal, the tenant goes on, they do collect, I think it's $25 or $29.99. It does like a 50 state kind of thing. But you're right. I mean, one of the things I always say is, establish your criteria, just like you said, in writing. Have a written, list of your requirements, making sure that, you're not violating. And, and the other thing is what you just said with service pets. And I don't know how it is. I'm only speaking about Maryland. But, fair housing, as far as HUD, there are, 7 primary, areas that you have to be sure that you're not discriminating against. And then every state has their own state laws as well, which kind of adds to that list. And I know, we just went to, source of income. You can't discriminate based on source of income, which means like a voucher, a voucher program. Yep. I can't tell you how many times I talk to agents, or one of my agents speaks with another agent. They're like, oh, well, we don't take vouchers. Like, I think you need to go back and, check, because
that's a fair housing violation.
Yeah, that's a violation. States. Right. And, they're like, well, that's what my landlord said. So, I mean, we do hear a lot. And then service pets too, no dogs or something, no pets. And then all of a sudden they have a service pet, and, you're saying, well, you have to make sure that you are familiar with your laws, stay out of trouble. And especially when it comes down to, I mean, you don't want to, we want to be fair. But let's talk about, besides that, now you have, an applicant that you've gone through, they've met your criteria, you do your credit check, they check all those boxes that you have. Is there anything else that you suggest? I mean, some people will do, inspections to where they are. They'll call references. They'll kind of get into more of like, who is this person? Do you have any advice for that? Should they stay away from that? Should they just go with the list of criteria? That's it. First come, first serve. You get the place. Or, do you recommend that they go further than that?
Well, I think it's always a standard process that you have, but I think the more detailed and more comprehensive your process is, the better. Keeping in mind that you're always following fair housing. So like past landlord checks, fantastic. I highly recommend it. That every landlord should do it, especially because you're signing 12 months, like you're getting into a relationship and a legally binding contract with this person. I highly recommend that you do it. The thing is that you have to make sure from a fair housing perspective that you are being very objective with those questions. So when you write down that here's my process and here's how I qualify tenants, when you get to those questions for past landlords or also for employers, you have to make sure those questions are very objective and follow fair housing for your state. So let me give you an example. If you say something like, did the tenant pay rent on time every time? That's objective. If you say, hey, did you like the tenant, or were they kind of a nuisance? That is not objective, right? That is not following, that suddenly straying off of a path where it's not like a yes or no answer. Did they violate any other parts of the lease agreement? That's objective, right? But there's certain things you can't say. And so you have to make sure it's a clear and standard process. And you're never going to get into a situation where suddenly it's like, oh gosh, well, the past landlord said they submitted too many maintenance requests. So like, I don't want to rent to this tenant. No, that's not a lease violation. For all we know, that landlord could be a slumlord and never fixed the place, and that's why they were putting them in. And so I think, more data points and more research is better, as long as you can back it up. As long as you say, this is my process, this has always been my process, here's all the tenants who've gone through it, here's where things become like red of no. And you've gone through my process, and this is why I've said no. And it's something that you would be comfortable sharing with the tenant. Now, you wouldn't share the past landlord what they said from that perspective. But in other words, if accidentally those papers got out to the tenant, it wouldn't be something where if it ended up in a courtroom, the court would say, yeah, you discriminated. And so I think that's important. But I do think like you really want to know this person as much as possible and do that research. And sometimes the past landlord will go off track. Sometimes you'll be on the phone with them and they'll be like, that was the best tenant, you have to rent to them, this and that. But you want to stay on track with your questions and say, nope, this is my process and how it works.
Gotcha. What about, we touched on it, a lot of times, and if you're listening, if you're an investor and you're looking for properties and you're a beginner, a lot of times in the MLS, you'll see a multifamily or 2 or 3 unit dwelling. And Dana had mentioned, trying to rent every possible aspect, put apartments in every floor. Mm-hmm. The problem with that is, it may not be allowed. So you may not have the density allowance for it in that particular zoning area of zoning. So make sure that you're checking, so don't just take the agent's advice that it's a multifamily unit, because even if it has tenants in place, I've seen where the buyer of that property that has the multifamily, 3 units, and it's only allowed to be a 1 unit dwelling, they really don't have much to go back on. You're the one that has to deal with it. You're the new owner. When you buy a property with, violations, typically you own it now. So, and I know of landlords that had to vacate the premises. They had to go through these lengthy, processes to try and make it a multi-unit dwelling that was set up for it. Even if it's been multi-metered, it doesn't mean that it was done correctly. So, and again, here in Maryland, I can talk about that. I don't know about other states, but make sure that you're calling down to the Department of Zoning and ask the question, hey, I'm thinking about buying this house. It's advertised as a 2 unit dwelling. I just want to make sure, is it allowed to have 2 units in it? Because at least here in Maryland, our tax records are not always right. So it may say 1 unit, but it actually is 2 units. It just wasn't updated. So definitely check. I always recommend, going through the rental license process, because, it's going to be as much for you as it is for the tenant. Definitely, make sure that you're trying to do that. What about lead paint, Dana?
Yeah, so certain counties in certain states, you have lead paint disclosures. And typically what I see, so that's like an addendum on the lease. So you have the lease, and then that's the last form. And that is where you have to disclose of whether or not there's lead paint. And a lot of times the owners don't. So they disclose, I am not aware, and I have not been made aware of lead paint. Most will check that box. However, if you know there's lead paint, it came through in one of your inspection reports when you purchased the property. Hopefully you looked through that in detail. If you know there's lead paint and there's something like that, and you don't disclose it, you're in huge trouble. And so just make sure, I think this is the point, Todd, where it's like landlords get greedy. They say, "Oh, look at this price for these 3 units. Oh, wow, that's amazing." Like, they were doing it illegally, so I can do it illegally. Or, "Oh, hey, I'm not going to disclose this because I want the tenants and I'm just going to pretend I didn't know about it." Everything always catches up to you in the end. And so, like with anything with business, you want to make sure you're super transparent from that perspective. And transparency, but only if you're professional. If you're transparent and you're not professional, that's not a good thing. But making sure that you go to bed every night knowing that you've crossed your T's and dotted your I's. If you do that, you'll really be set up for success in the business.
Good advice. I know here in Maryland, we have a little different lead paint, requirements. If it's pre-78 and it has not been, registered as lead free, even limited lead free, you have to, every time the tenant moves out, you have to retest and make sure, get a lead inspector that says, hey, there's no chipping, peeling, flaking paint. So that is a big thing here in Maryland. So yeah, I mean, like Dana's saying, make sure that you are checking what your laws are in the state as it pertains to that. One of the things that I just want to touch on too, that I see a lot of, and I've been guilty of this myself, in the rental properties that I own, raising rents. One of the things with rentals is, and I think why it's so attractive for a lot of these, institutional buyers is that with inflation, and I think it's fair to say we're going to have inflation. I think we're seeing it now. I think I see it in the grocery store, right? The boxes, things are getting smaller, like I can eat more. And I'm like, I couldn't eat that much before, it's like I ate the whole box. So I think things are definitely, inflation's happening in many different ways. But one of the things that happens in inflation is rents go up, right? Because if somebody's now making 3 times the amount of money, they can pay 3 times the amount of rent. So, I think that rent prices are going to go up. I do think if you can get into the space, I think it's a great business to be in, and you can do very well, and you can provide a great place for your tenants. But raising the rents, I've been bad at this, raising rents on an annual basis. I've always been like, well, if they're in, they're paying the bills. My mortgage is locked in. But then all of a sudden you realize they've been in for 5 or 7 years, and now you're so far away with what you should be getting for rent. So I think that, some of my advice is, go ahead and get a cost of living increase on your rents, even if it's only a couple percent, 2% a year or whatever. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes I've made. And then, really just make sure, something I've been very good at is make sure that you're very responsive for your tenants, because if you take care of them, they'll stay longer. And if you take care of them, even if they don't stay long, they'll take care of your place. And I always say, they're not going to take care of it if you don't care about it. So, if you're there showing up, making sure that things are fixed and that you're checking in with them, like Dana said, communication. This is a business. Absence doesn't make the heart grow fonder. You have to communicate. It's 9/10 of it, but if you are communicating with them and you're regularly checking things, making sure that they have a great place to live, it gives them a little bit more pride in knowing that you do care, and my experience is they take better care of it. It is a relationship, like Dana has mentioned. So, any other rental advice, Dana?
Well, I think based on that point that you just made, something super important, because we were talking about fair housing and had that as part of the topic of conversation here, is that when you raise the rental rates, you have to make sure this is where actually we do see some fair housing violations. Hey, the tenant in unit A, they've been a fantastic tenant. They haven't put in maintenance requests. They're super easygoing. They're not nitpicky. I'm only going to raise their rent by 1%. Tenant in unit B, oh gosh, they're so annoying. They always email me about this and that. I'm going to raise their rent by 3%. That's a fair housing violation. You need to back everything up with the data. And so, to your point, Todd, like, I do recommend keeping it under market, right? Because you don't want them to move. Vacancy is expensive for you. If you have a great tenant, leave them in there. Do it a bit under market, but make sure they know, even if it's a tiny amount, just set that expectation that you will get little bit of an increase here and there every year, even if it's not a lot. That way it's not a surprise on year 5. What? They increased my rent? They've never done that.
Right.
And so making sure that is transparent. But you do need to 100% go through the process and say, okay, here are the rental comps. Here is why we're raising it by this amount. We can back it up because here are the comparable properties. It's actually under those properties, but that is why. Here's 5 properties on market at these prices that are comparable to mine. Here's the report. This is why the rental is now 1%, 2%, 3% higher. And backing up with that data. And don't just do the link because that property is going to be taken off market at some time. Screenshot it with the date, the time, everything in there. Have it so this is what we see as the data on the market. And it makes it so much easier because every tenant comes back and says, don't raise my rent, I might move out. Well, if you have the data to back it up, they're like, oh, wow, they've done their research. This is cheaper to live in than having to move and pay moving costs and paying a new security deposit and getting a rental at a slightly higher price than what I have. And so that's where, like you said, communication is important, but also just doing your due diligence as well.
And prices are going up. I mean, repair costs are up, appliances are up. I mean, it is important. I mean, that you do try and, you want to be fair, but you also want to make sure that you're not covering yourself short and putting yourself in a bad situation too. How about as far as, we'll just cover a couple more of these. What do you think about failure to pay? So I don't know how it is in California, but a lot of times, people say if it goes past the 5th of the month, there's a fee or a late fee at some point. And, I've been kind of bad at this too. It's not that I want to collect a late fee from people, but, it's like, you want to try and give them some kind of urgency to actually pay you in time. I mean, a lot of times your mortgage payment's due on the 1st of the month. So you want to try and get your rents on time. Do you recommend that people, some management companies, they say, oh, on the 5th of the month, you got to fill out a failure to pay. If you don't do that filing, you're making a mistake. What's your opinion on that? And do you guys have that in California?
Yeah, so I don't see the failure to pay as often as I just see the eviction notice posted. But first, the late fees go out. I think the biggest thing there is making sure that tenants, when they sign the lease, they're very clear that we don't stray from this lease. Because if you say, I've got a late fee, say in your lease agreement, it says on the 5th of the month, the late fee is $50, followed by $10 per day afterwards. Okay, now your tenant is late. And they email you and they say, hey, can you waive that late fee? If you waive that late fee, you're just basically telling them that lease contract is not what we have as a legally binding contract, and I will go off of it. So this is what it says, but I've got flexibility here. I will waive that late fee for you. What you want to make sure that's important, because you've given 5 days. It's late on the 2nd, right? It's not like it's, oh, shoot, I forgot to pay on the 1st of the month because, something happened and it's a 2nd and you're charging a late fee. That's why you give a grace period. It's very important when you sign the lease to sit there with them and say, can you confirm you read that there's a late fee? I don't waive those. I don't care what the excuse is. I do not waive those. You can set up automatic payment in the system if you're scared that it's not going to pay. Set it up for the 1st of the month, but I'm not going to waive that late fee, so don't ask. If you set that up, the tenant is not going to come to you and say, can you waive that late fee? They're going to know this is the process. You've already told me you're not waiving it. And you've already told me that contract, we have to stick to it. And so I think that would be one thing that I would say would be super important with it. And then, serving the eviction notice, if you don't hear from them now, you can't do that right now, but depending on the situation, but serving that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, some great information. What about, so as far as trends, what about multifamily? Are you seeing that the institutional buyers are buying those as well? Or are you just seeing that they're diving into the single family market?
I mean, a lot of institutionals I see going into the single family, it's usually for larger ones. It's usually the REITs, obviously.
Yeah.
That have the huge apartment complexes, and something in the middle, so 78% of rental properties are under 20 unit complexes. And so mass market is at that like lower end.
Wow.
But I typically hear of institutionals purchasing single families. Um, although there are certain cases where I see them go into multi, I do see single families typically where they go, and it could be also like a risk, hedging their risk, because when they sell it, they can sell it to a investor, or they could sell it to an individual
Right. A retail
for
buyer. Yeah.
their primary home. So I think they do it also to hedge things as well.
Yeah, that's smart. That's a good point too. Well, Dana, thank you so much. I mean, this is, again, I mean, awesome information. Guys, you should check out Dana's platform, Hemlane. The link's in the show notes. She's doing amazing things and just growing. And I think in a market where, we really need people to step up and, deliver affordable housing and safe housing. And guys, it's a great business to be in. And Dana,
Great. Well, thanks, Todd, for
amazing
having
show.
me. Yeah, I always learned a lot from you as well. I didn't realize with the lead disclosure that you guys do, that you actually have to get it inspected. So I learned a new thing every time I talk with you. So this was great.
You do. So if you're ready to invest in Maryland, man, we can help you out.
Now I know.
We can
Yeah.
set you up.
Perfect.
All right. Well, Dana, until next time, guys, thank you so much for watching. We always appreciate your comments. And if you haven't already done so, go ahead and give this video a like if you like the content, so you get more just like it. And always, we appreciate it if you would subscribe, as well as to Dana's YouTube channel as well. Until next time, guys, have a great week.